Huh? Okay. Now, you see my screen, I hope. Um, your strategic communication plans are spectacular. They're fantastic. I'm not saying there's anything imperfect about them. I'm just suggesting we went over this. It's been now 3 months ago, so I just wanted to refresh some points that might be useful in doing this type of project in the future. This is not a criticism. These are just um, some recollections of things we've talked about. The US military notion of SMART, strategic, measurable, achievable, results oriented, time bound. Now, some of you in your Stratcom plans did this very admirably. One of you actually said you gave a 25% within 1 year. That's great. That's a double A. That's terrific. But let's let's consider this as not only the things you do when faced with a crisis, the way you think, but also elements that you would use in a Stratcom or any other type of plan. Strategic, that is thinking forward, measurable. Have some metrics in there, and I hope that Mike can share with us if Search for Common Ground uses any of this type of methodology. That would be useful. Measurable. Put some numbers in there. They don't have to be real. They can be imagined, they can be aspirational, but just put them in there in terms of what you intend to do. What I want to stress the most here is the results-oriented thing. Remember this stages of a strategy. Sometimes we talked about this, we mentioned it as what we call the end state. If you are involved in a crisis and you're planning a strategy to deal with it, what you want to do, I think, first of all, is imagine what if you were to succeed? What would we sometimes use this phrase? What would success look like? And if you remember, it's been a few months, so I thought we would just go over this. The stages that you go through, and I've seen in Washington very, very few people ever use this format, and they really should. Here's what happens when there's a crisis. You can do nothing at all. If you remember the metaphor I used, you are the governor of a very disturbed province in Pakistan called Waziristan. It's the northwest corner of northwest corner of Pakistan, where there, let's say, 500 assassinations per month. Your goal, you must think beyond the steps of what you're going to do. Think of the final goal. The final goal from 500 assassinations a month, you cannot get to zero, but you can reduce the numbers. And so I think at the outset, what you want to do is state a realistic number that you might be able to achieve. Now, um, let's say from 500 per month, you're going to a funder, a source of funding. It could be the European Union, it could be a private funding organization. Um, you want to state upfront what is it that you would like to have as an outcome as a result of what you're doing. And then the stages, if you remember the metaphor, I'm the governor of Waziristan province. My goal is to reduce the number of assassinations. Okay, that's a given. How do I get there? First of all, I recognize at this moment I'm not doing anything at all. That's called stasis. Input. I've put aside some money for the construction of an assembly factory, which would employ 1,000 young people and maybe take them away from their tendencies to be involved in terrorism and assassination. All I'm doing here, I'm spending money. That's not a result. That's just the first stage of doing something about it. Output. I have um, I have built an assembly plant in Waziristan province. Has this solved the problem? No, it has not. All it has done is get me one step further in the direction of the end state that I'm seeking. Outcome. I have opened the plant I have employed 1,000 young people. I still don't know, even at this point, I don't know if this is going to bring down the number of assassinations. Result. Aha. I can quantify in time and in numbers that the numbers of assassinations have gone down. So here's a little summary. And again, and I'd love to hear Mike's comments on this. I have seen in Washington very few instances, certainly in the State Department, I almost never see these principles put into practice. And and so I just thought we would review that. Let's see. I want to stop share. How do we do that? Stop share. Okay, here we are. Um, okay. So I just wanted to review that. Again, this is not criticism. Your papers are outstanding. I just thought in the future, when you're thinking of responding to a crisis, consider those elements. Mike Jobbins, Search for Common Ground. Wow, you're the only, I mean, there may be others, but you're the only organization that I know of that actually has measurable success in reducing conflict. How do you do that, Mike? Uh,
Thanks.
uh,
Thanks a lot, Dan. It's great to be here and great to be with so many of you. Like you said, I'm Mike Jobbins. I'm with Search for Common Ground. Um, we're an international conflict resolution nonprofit. We support efforts around the world with about 55 offices in 35 countries. And I've been with the organization 17 years. So, Dan, to be honest, I've been with the organization 17 years, and every single day I discover something new my colleagues are doing somewhere to support peace and conflict resolution around the world. Um, but I think there are two things that are quite unique about the organization. And one is we try to encourage an entrepreneurial approach. At the end of the day, no one knows exactly what will help bring an end to the war in Congo or in Israel and Palestine or in Myanmar. And so the approach that the organization takes is to recruit what we call multi-partial teams, build mixes of people who work and reflect the diversity of a society. So Hutus and Tutsis in Burundi, Christians and Muslims in Nigeria, and let them try things and figure out what makes the most sense. So we try to encourage entrepreneurship with multi-partial teams. And then I think one of the other principles is that you can't build with what you don't have. And I think a lot of times when, I don't know, the European Union or the World Bank or others show up in a place that's experiencing violent conflict, you start making a list of everything. They start making up a list of everything they don't have. They don't show up in Yemen and they'll say, well, there's no food, there's no water, there's no political will, there's no ceasefire, there's no accountability for war crimes, there's no, and then try to design what they want to do against what they don't have. Um, that may work for some. That's not how we do it. We tend to look in Yemen, there are all those things that they don't have, but 90% of the schools are open. So how do you work with the schools? How do you work with the teachers to help rebuild the school systems as a place for the next generation to come together? How do you work with the Ministry of Education and the teachers to become a bedrock for local governance? So I think those are two of the ways that we try to build from the bottom up, and we use a lot of media and public communications tools to engage with public opinion. So it's really interesting also hearing some of your initial reflections on the on the matter.
um, okay, there's a succinct and challenging introduction. Let's take your last point, Mike.
Yeah,
The media aspect. This is sort of the focus of this particular module.
yeah,
So tell us, how do you do this on the internet, with video,
yeah,
audio? How do you do
yeah,
that?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Search for Common Ground, we were founded by a former journalist, and I think the first thing in a lot of the places where we work is even just recognizing that public opinion matters in
Mhm.
peace processes. Deep down, you look at a lot of the kind of deal making processes that go along around a lot of the bargains and people leaders flying from this place to that place, and the people and what people think about what's being signed really um, can get lost. So you look at like and yet what people, we live in an age where what one kid in the rural hills of Congo with a gun can upset everything agreed in the grand conference rooms in Geneva or Doha, or Washington. And yet, the way that ordinary people see what's being agreed to gets really forgotten. Um, and yet, and the agency of people living in conflict zones is tremendous. So, for example, in in Nigeria and Niger, there was an insurgency called Boko Haram, a terror group with some links to ISIS that's been devastating the region for more than nearly 15 years now. And we worked with the local governments to produce a series of radio shows that would be broadcast and would send via WhatsApp to people who are fighting. And we found that almost, I think, three-quarters of Boko Haram defectors, people who left the movement and surrendered, listened to our radio shows. And the majority said that listening to the shows helped them decide to ultimately leave the movement. They can get lost in the world of sort of security or diplomacy that like every single person wakes up every day and chooses how they want to spend it. And even, the rank and file fighters in that case choose, many of them, when presented with their options, and when it was explained to them, many of them chose to leave. Many of them didn't. But the way people see things and understand things is really, really central. And so, that's one of the key points. So it's just public opinion matters, that every single person, including the rank and file combatants, their attitudes and opinions matter. So I guess that would be maybe the first lesson. I don't know. I have maybe two or three more that I'm happy to share too, of kinds of things that we saw.
Yeah, let's get to two or three. But first of all, what's involved in getting a radio show on the air? You mentioned that you work with government. Do you do public what do you call them? PSC, what do you
PSAs.
PSAs, or do you do actually interactive programs?
Yeah.
And how do you measure the audience?
Yeah, so first of all, by and large, what we do that in that case, it was more PSAs. There were short messages that were being broadcast as like specials on
Sorry,
local radio
public
stations.
service announcements
That's
for,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, so some of those were like short messages because it was really an informational product. This is how you defect. These are your options. These are interviews from people saying that, if you come back, that they would welcome you home, things like that. By and large, that's not really what we do. We would do that, but often what we'll do is we'll try to create much longer arcs, and often a lot more sort of entertainment focused content, because ultimately people have to like it, and first of all, people have to want to listen. And eat your vegetables approach never really builds you the radio audience or the TV audience, or whatever that you want. But secondly, the degree to which you're able to produce something that fits within the local culture, is really important. And so we produce probably about 20 or so weekly radio shows around Africa, a little bit in the Middle East. We have a couple of TV shows. And the value of that is it helps also people visualize what they don't necessarily see in their daily life. So like in South Sudan, a place where people hadn't, we've had a history of really depraved rebellions and predation, a violent security forces. We produce a hit detective show called Sergeant Esther. It's about a female policewoman solving crimes. It's entertaining, it's light, it's humorous, but it also helps people model who've never actually seen a policeman, let alone a policewoman, doing the job properly in line with South Sudanese law. It helps people sort of envision what could be normal, what is normal in other parts of the world, what the law says ought to happen. Because ultimately, like if you can't, like they say, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And so if there's not an example in your community of like how a police officer ought to behave, the radio in that case is a great opportunity to sort of create those models, create the standards to which you might hold the actual policeman on the corner accountable to, and to do it in a way that that's engaging not just at an intellectual level, but particularly women, young people, older folks who haven't had the opportunity to go to school, that you're also reaching sort of every element of the population.
This is great. I hope I have written this out in bold letters. If you can't see it, you can't be it. That's a great watchword to go by. So, Mike, how do you get these things on the air? And I'm sure you use local advisors who speak, I think it's called Juba Arabic. Is that the name of the language?
Yeah,
It's mainly Arabic, but a little bit adapted to South Sudan.
yeah,
Surely you have to use local people. How do you find them? How do you remunerate them and encourage
yeah, yeah. So the
them?
way we work, there are a couple of different ways, but the way Search for Common Ground works is we'll typically open up a production studio. So that's how we operate in South Sudan. So we do the production. We'll work with local actors, script writers, and develop. In this case, in South Sudan, we worked with sort of the University of
Juba.
South Sudan, or Juba's
Yeah.
one of the theater professors there, to
Oh my
kind of build
God.
a team from the students there, and we run it like a real production studio. So we have in the same ways like Netflix, the streaming service, has every bit of data about me and what I watch. Still, 9 times out of 10, their recommendations are wrong. And so there's a part of it is science, but part of it's also art. Otherwise, it's not going to succeed. So when we produced that Sergeant Esther, I think we had about 5 shows that we were producing. The others flopped after one season, and Sergeant Esther hit it big. And that's kind of how we approach it, to experiment, to try different formats and shows, and then we syndicate it. So we'll work with local community in South Sudan. You have a number of community radio stations supported by the community. You have a few. The Catholic Church has a pretty strong radio network. Some of the Protestants churches do as well. The UN was supporting radio stations, so we produce it. We produce the content, and then we'll work with others, usually local outlets that are doing the broadcast, and we'll support them, and we'll give them a little bit of a support financially to make sure that they write reports back, and to go to the question of how you monitor and evaluate the success. But by and large, we're giving them the content, and then they're the ones who manage the fitting it in and broadcasting it.
So, what are the obstacles? Does the government ever become suspicious of an outside oriented activity?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does. The governments can be suspicious if you're not doing it because everyone's alert to the risk of sort of propaganda,
Hmm.
or foreign organizations coming in passing messages. I do find, so we always will do MOUs with the local government. We'll often work. It's funny, a lot of times when you're working with things, if it's couched as an artistic endeavor and a cultural endeavor rather than a political one, you get a little bit more leeway.
Hmm.
When your government interlocutors like the Ministry of Culture or the ministry, then um, and by and large in South Sudan, let's say, I mean, it was really appreciated because they also saw it as an investment in sort of the creative industries in South Sudan. We were working with the university, we were broadcasting on the radio stations, it was all local actors and script writers. They appreciated that it was an international group that was coming in and sharing sort of world leading, techniques in drama production and things like that. So generally, I'd say it's been much more accepted than one would have expected, but it is still delicate. And one of the key choices is finding exactly who. It's very different to say, hey, we're going to create an artist, a radio show that talks about peace, to say, hey, we're here to work on peace and we're going to do a bunch of stratcom stuff. Because that latter bucket, if it's framed in that way, will make the governments a lot more nervous.
Fantastic. So your first stop is the government to be very transparent, not to be coming in and cloaked in secrecy and all that. How do you motivate the local media? Just by paying them?
No, I mean, look, every media everywhere in the world is strapped for content. And similarly, if the stuff is no good, they're not going to broadcast it no matter what, right? So you need, first of all, you need to have a good product, help them understand also the social purpose. Like we'll tend to work more with media who have some sort of public interest mission and mandate. You do have commercial radios that just play music all day, which is great for entertainment. But we tend to get more traction with the radios who have a social purpose. So they may be also broadcasting on the crop reports and local news and things. And generally, sort of the public interest media is a more natural home. It's also more natural for our things, for our content to be sitting next to something that is also public interested than than something purely commercial. So generally, first when we're working with the local media, it's really focused on the having a good product, having something that fits in line with, and really explaining to them why we're doing it the same way as I'm explaining it to you. Um, and if we are paying them, it's not really, we're not, it's not like pay to play. It's only really to ensure that they write reports back. Because if we have to have a report, when did this air? How did it air? What was the, what is it airing commercial free? Because we often don't want to have a beer commercial show up in the middle of our detective show. We'll then that's why we might be paying them a little bit. But the primary interest is a social purpose one. And if it's not rooted in that, and if it's not rooted in creating something that people actually like, then it's not going to work.
Yeah. So you're, if I understand, you're paying more for airing, let's say 3 times a day, something like that, rather than for the production costs, which
Right?
you
We
do
don't pay.
yourself.
We do the
Yeah.
production ourselves, yeah, and then the payment,
Mm.
any payments, which we don't always, but if we are, it's to really just enable the reporting back to us.
Yeah.
How many times did it air? Can you write us a memo about what your listeners think about the show?
Fantastic. Is it possible from memory to tell us from beginning to end, what are the stages of a project like that? Do you actually go to the field, or do you have people on the ground that you trust, who are search employees and they're trained in your methodology? How does this go about?
Yeah, so everywhere that search works, we have offices, we have local offices that are registered, usually led by local people. Um, all of our teams are probably 95% people from that society, and usually there are a couple of foreigners to also bring an outside perspective. And they tend to match the diversity of a society. So in South Sudan, for example, we have Dinka and Nuer, Equatorians in the team, men, women, old, young. And the way we'll walk through is first we'll say, well, look, what's the issue? They meet. What's the issue we want to talk about? They say, okay, we want to work on police reform, and in community safety. What's the big, um, way that what are some of the big public challenges? And then we'll say, okay, well, we need a radio show. And so it's a creative and iterative process to figure out what we want to do, and then we'll often find partners and build a set of teams. I think we're one of the few organizations where we have, if you look through our job database, you have people whose job titles like comedian or talk show host or whatever. So we'll build the team to match the production, and usually it's really quite it's quite a creative kind of process. But what is like everyone has limited resources, and so when it comes, making sure that you're really hitting something that resonates with the right demographic. And when we're measuring it afterwards, sort of the results of the program, the way we measure it is a very simple framework. There's different ways to measure it, but a very simple framework that we use is sort of reach, relevance, and resonance.
Mhm.
Um, which is reach, like how many people did you reach? Did you actually reach the right people? Because for our kinds of things, you could be producing a show focused on Boko Haram armed groups, and you could have 10 million listeners, but if none of the listeners are the actual people who are fighting or at risk, then you've missed the trick, or you missed it. So one is like, did you reach the right people? How many people did you reach, and were they the right sort of people that you wanted to? Did the Was what you were doing seen as relevant to the issue that you were working on? So you could reach a lot of women, let's say in rural South Sudan, with a detective show, and they say, well, this is really great comedy content, because it is lighthearted, or this is really great. It taught me, it's, but if they don't see it as necessarily relevant in the wider social life, for us, that doesn't necessarily um, mean success. And then finally, like resonance, does the content of the show actually sort of resonate? Does it feel authentic? Do they feel like it is helpful on the issue that we're talking about? So that's sort of the three we call the three R's approach. to measuring the success of a media campaign, at least a media effort, at least in our sort of piece
Three
of
R's: resonance, relevance. What's the other R?
reach,
Reach. Uh-huh.
reach, relevance,
Okay.
resonance.
Well, fascinating. These standards are, or these measurements are admittedly very subjective. Um, and I hope that the funders who fund search understand you can't give them exact numbers on a graph, can you? So how do you work with the funding organization to demonstrate to them we have some success, we can't show it in numbers, but we can convince, how do you convince them?
Yeah, I mean it's tough. It's it varies very much from funder to funder. Like, with the end of a lot of the USAID funding, a lot more of our funding comes from foundations and others. Some of them really believe in them, like they really believe they see themselves as media funders, and therefore they're really interested in the quality of what's being produced. Others, many see themselves as much more politically minded, and so they want to see the impact in the real world. The way we tend to approach it, and that I think I'd advise a lot of NGO and nonprofits working here, is we'll tend to try and demonstrate the impact with a limited number of audience, because you don't know, you're broadcasting to millions across vast remote areas, different zones of control and so forth. But if you know that it's made an impact in this community or on these people's lives or those people's lives, then you can, if you multiply it by the millions of listeners, and you can do some quick like SMS surveys and things like that, then you can get a more aggregated sense of what would of what the impact might be. So that's typically how we would do it. We sort of combine some in-depth, maybe focus groups or in-depth interviews about what impact the show has had on some small subset of the
Mhm.
listeners, and then would multiply it out. Um, Once you're implanted in a community, and you really have a hit, people in that community know. I mean, in Liberia, during the war in Liberia, the president then, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the president, used to listen to our radio shows while she was having her hair done in the morning, before she went on her professional things. She would listen to the in some way within the society, if you have a hit, everyone knows it. Um, it's once you get outside it, when you have the more skeptical people in a donor capital, or a far off philanthropist, or someone who's even just at an elite, that they themselves don't listen to the radio because they have access to all of the Starlinks and the whatevers, that you start to that's when people start to get a little more skeptical.
Yeah. For the people in this call, some of them are advanced university students looking at careers, monitoring and evaluation. Is this a career?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a career for sure. I mean, it's one of the specialized areas. It's within in nonprofits, and it's absolutely important. In the same way as you have to have auditors and finance people to keep your finances honest, it's even more important that you have monitoring evaluation people to keep
Yeah.
your impact honest, and to help you learn. Because and this is sort of on the ground, at least nothing we ever do succeeds 10 out of 10, nor does it ever fail 0 out of 10. So
Yeah.
much of the art is like getting from a 4 out of 10 to a 6 out of 10, or getting a 7 out of 10 to an
Yeah.
8 out of,
Right.
and incremental improvements. And so monitoring evaluation is really important, both sort of the qualitative side, as well as the
Mhm.
quantitative.
Um,
Yeah.
and I mention that because in the US, there are many places where you can get a master's degree in M&E. I don't know if that's the case in Kenya, Ukraine, and other places, but I think it's worth noting that if you don't have a local way of getting this expertise, and this intrigues you, it can appear to be dry and not passionate and not involved, but it's extremely important to NGOs that depend on funding organizations. They cannot get funding without some evidence of what they're doing. And secondly, you said you had two or three other examples. The timeline, let's take the policewoman, for example,
Yeah.
in South Sudan. Did that take 6 months to produce, or how long did it take?
Yeah, let's see. So it took about, I'd say it probably took about 6 months to get it going.
Uh,
But what I would say is, what we also know is for a radio show, it's really about only when you hit maybe 18 months of broadcast that you
uh,
really hit your peak listenership and relevance. Because, people and the same thing with radio, with TV, or any kind of thing, unless you have a massive marketing budget, you're counting on people to stumble in it. And the way a lot of iterative shows, radio or even more regular broadcast type TV shows, is you're counting on people
mhm.
to find you, to listen, to become attached to your product, to say, hey, I want to listen about it. So I want to make time in my day to listen to it. I talk to my friends about it. I think about it, and um, so I think that's one. So I think that's one way, that is probably about 6 months of production, and then there's impact immediately, but it's really over about, we think about it in 18 months before you're hitting your peak, hitting your stride.
So
Uh,
a successful project, figure 2 years to make it work. Um, in the case of South Sudan, you mentioned that very few people had seen any policeman doing a job properly. Is there any way of determining did the performance of the police, men and women, improve at all thanks to this series?
it's a good question in South Sudan. I'm not sure that we've done the evaluation in South Sudan. I will say in Congo, where we have a very similar show, it's a TV show. Um, when we did the surveys, I mean, we did find enormous. I think we had probably 90% market share of the Congolese police listen. They themselves listened to our show. Many of them found
Wow.
it themselves to be educational about the different elements of law, not just and the role and responsibilities of the police. So it was deeply appreciated, and at that time, the places where we were at that time, we were doing, in Congo, we were doing a lot of work, also direct training of the police and things like that. So I can't say it was exclusively just this one show,
Yeah.
but we did see the show plus a combination of real world activities. I think JOP improved confidence by about 30% in public security forces. So
Wow.
it was a really dramatic jump. And the show was part of a wider push.
Yeah. This is very subjective. Is it your notion? I think I believe this. Police who are underpaid and badly treated and don't have the resources, they don't want to be corrupt. They don't want to be incompetent, but they don't have the resources to do better. And with a bit of motivation, of course, getting a proper salary would make an enormous difference, right? And having I remember in Haiti when I was there, many police precincts had no automobiles. There's not much you can do in a large province or arrondissement without transport. Do you think that in the troubled countries where you've worked, the civil servants, they're not, they don't want to be bad, do they? They want to have the opportunity. Am I being naive and utopian by saying that?
No, I don't know. I'll go back to Congo, which is where I spent a lot of time in Congo, and ran some of the military and police training efforts there. And I don't know, my experience with the Congolese military, which is also quite notorious. When I was there, about half the sexual abuse in the east of the country was committed by the army and the police. And my sense is, mm, the police are quite, and army are quite a lot like you and me, in that 5% of them are good eggs, 5% are rotten apples, and 90% tend to go with the flow, and
Yeah.
and absorb what was going on around them somewhat passively. And so, in Congo, you had a dynamic where a lot of people from the rebel groups had integrated into the army. People who had been fighting in the really brutal war, then integrated into the army, and or the police, and in a rebellion, in that kind of rebellion that was being fought, the people who were the first to loot, steal, to reward the boys, with women, with loot, whatever, were the ones who rose to prominence within those groups. And so as a result, some of the worst actors occupied the highest positions. And so when then they get integrated in the army, that kind of behavior is, of course, completely unacceptable. But the way you break that down is really as much is ideally about the formal systems. Do they get paid? Is there corruption? Do bad police officers and military go to jail? Like all of that is ideally what would happen, but in reality, that's not always.
Mhm.
That's a 10-20 year project. And so one of the things that we'll try to do is create a dynamic where a commander will say, I don't know how things are operated in the wherever unit you came from, but here in the 112th, we don't act that way. And so creating those kind of like social norms within the bureaucracies reinforce they're good people in every bureaucracy, they're bad people in every bureaucracy. But how whether the bureaucracy itself is good or bad depends on the systems and incentives that get set up by leadership. But they also get influenced by the social norms, the expectations, and what's accepted or not accepted as behaviors. And so, even if a cop isn't paid, that doesn't mean he has to go out and rape someone. Even if he needs, and so even if a cop's commander is rotten, that doesn't mean he needs to shake down, the traitors and
Mhm.
coming in and out of town. So part of it is really how we work on that. The social side is easier to move, can be moved more quickly, and through like nonprofits like us, even if there is that need for sort of structural reform in
Mhm.
Congo and South Sudan and Nigeria and in a lot of places.
Yeah. And before we go to the two or three other examples, um, how often are you required to travel to the field? It seems you have a great network of trusted employees and trusted colleagues, but in some cases, I guess you have to go out there yourself. How often does that happen?
Yeah. I mean, I spent about 10 years in Congo, and then I ran the Africa desk and spent a lot of time in different countries. Now I spend a lot more of my time fundraising
Ah,
and things
yeah.
out of headquarters. I'll also go out a few times a year to our different colleges, particularly if we're getting set up in different places or creating new programs. So I'll still travel one or two times a year to these places, and then more often when
Mhm.
I'm yeah.
So it sounds like you have a system going which pretty much takes care of itself. Your visits probably 10 years ago, you had to be there in order to initiate a project. Maybe now um, you have a more developed infrastructure that you don't need to do that as often. Is that correct?
I, yeah, I think that's right. I think the world's also advanced too. They have a lot more partners in a lot of these societies than there were 10 or 20 years ago that we can work with. Also, just you can do a lot more with Zoom and so forth. So,
Right.
so we don't travel quite as much, but it's still
Mhm.
necessary. And there's no replacement for face to face.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. I invite everybody to either, and just so Mike understands, some people don't have enough electricity to unmute themselves, so they sometimes put comments in the chat, but I'll be monitoring that. Any comments or questions are relevant. Mike, you said you had two or three other examples.
Maybe two other lessons if I was
Yeah.
designing well, maybe three. One is thinking a little bit about reasoning from your audience outwards. So yeah, I worked a
Mhm.
lot during Ebola when there were Ebola devastating disease outbreaks across Africa, and then later on in COVID. And in every crisis that I've ever worked in, um, the first instinct of the local government, often of the UN, is to say, "We are the government. The situation is under control." Um, and just trust us, do what we tell you, and the situation will be okay. There's a tendency to want to reassure the public and to
Mhm.
project we are the government and we're in charge, very open. And like the in Guinea, in West Africa, when the Ebola outbreak hit, the local government and UNICEF came together. They started recording a bunch of things in our radio show to get the word out about Ebola. And the whole thing was, we're the government, trust us. And this was an area where the public did not trust the government. There had just been
Uh-huh.
riots. The government was perceived to have just sort of illegitimately won an election. And, so no, you got to do the opposite. Like you can't, it's a lot easier to transfer. So one lesson that we took is it's a lot easier to transfer knowledge to people who are trusted than to take people who are trusted and or to take people who are knowledgeable and make them trusted. In other
Uh,
words, people if people don't trust the doctors, no amount of work will get them to trust the doctors in the middle of a crisis. The doctors have to work with the people that are already trusted. In that case, the traditional communicators, the local radio talk show hosts, the heads of local soccer federations. So that's one, is that sort of think through who's trusted,
mhm.
especially in a crisis, and get the knowledge to them rather than taking the knowledge, try and get every doctor to be trusted. And
How
especially if you're the government.
how in the world do you do that? By you ask a number of people, you're not local, but you do
Yeah.
have local employees that you
Yeah.
trust. Are they quite proficient in finding those trusted people? Must be
Yeah,
difficult.
I think so. I think so. I
Uh,
mean, what I would say is it's a creative process. It's a creative process. So you'll have people who, no one when Ebola broke out in Guinea, it was the first major Ebola outbreak. So it's not as though there was a clear template or anyone said, I have the answer. But rather it's a group of local people, also international people like me, say, well, when there was an Ebola outbreak in Congo, we found working with traditional leaders to be really helpful. Is that something that fits here? You know, so it's a brainstorming process that's largely about local people's sort of knowledge and guesswork. And
yeah.
again, work with the traditional leaders worked really well, worked with soccer clubs, worked with the talk show hosts really well. Thought we would work a lot with the truckers unions because they're traveling back and forth up and down roads. Didn't work. They weren't quite as connected as others. So there's a little bit of trial and error, um, as well as getting
You
people together. Yeah.
you have a tremendous advantage of having a positive history at Search. You've been around for 40 years or more, and you have an infrastructure. It takes a long time to build this up. Once you've done so, you can really benefit. Boniface Mwali in, I think, Nairobi has a comment. Boniface, uh, can you?
Yes, thank
Yeah.
you. Thanks, Dr. Whitman, and thank you, Mike, for the a very exciting presentation or contribution to the discussion. I I've done a bit of similar work at a much smaller scale as an animation producer. So
Huh?
it's very fascinating to hear the scale at which your programs are run and the relevance of it within the scope of peace and security. My question is whether you have had any experience, because even for in the media generally, the stories that tend to capture people's imagination are all often the more negative stories, and in cases where you're speaking about government policy, it's stories that are speaking about the lack or shortfalls of government policy. I don't know if you've had any experience where, because part of the goal of diplomacy is to find common ground. Do you work in content production where you're telling stories that are aligned to the government's sort of direction, and how does that uh, pan
Yeah.
out? Yeah.
Great question. Very sensitive question, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh,
No, absolutely. It's a very tough. It's a sensitive question because, of course, the government does have views on it. I think but we try, so we try and be really alert to it, and we try to be as creative as possible in navigating. And ultimately, at Search for Common Ground, our approach is not to tell a story that's like a morality tale. So and so is good, so and so is bad. But rather, a lot of our work is around creating characters that people can identify and resonate with, wherever they may be, and model different kinds of interactions. So, for example, we have a hit show. We had a hit show, television show in Myanmar, where there's a lot of divisions between Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and violent in a very closed military dictatorship government. And we worked there. We produced a show called The Team. It was a soccer team. It was based on a multi-ethnic soccer team competing on learning to play together. It's sort of similar to Ted Lasso, which is a U.S. show. It's sort of about the locker room of a soccer team, sort of learning to play together. People players from different backgrounds, and it was the first ever show where there was the first ever time that there was a Muslim on the state broadcaster, on the government, on the junta's broadcaster, and portrayed as not a foreigner or a bad guy. It was also one of the few times that there were Christians, played by Christians and portrayed there. And the success of the show was not about we should all get along or not get along or about any sort of approach to the government's policies, but rather we found afterwards, I think it was 2/3 of the households who would watch the show had a discussion afterwards about religion in about the different types of religion in the country, which a lot of people otherwise wouldn't have known, because they wouldn't have known that there were Christians and Muslims and so forth that weren't foreigners and that were living in this country. So sometimes the success isn't always what you're telling people through the show, is the kind of conversations that people have about your show, and often that can cut at a more deeper level than this or that governmental policy, but rather get to some of the more attitudinal attitudes that people have, or just knowledge about how people who are not like me, or not like this person, that people who are not like oneself, how they might be behaving in a different type of situation.
Mike, I don't know if you've seen the documentary, What Are We Doing Here? Are you familiar with that?
Mm-mm.
I looked at it yesterday. It's a kind of a heartbreaking tale of some Western people who travel in Africa they want to know what is it that's going wrong with the development industry. And a lot of the stories are very dark and very heartbreaking. I'm remembering one scene where a very poor girl in a house says that the only joy in her life is the radio. And there's a video clip of her. It's a wind-up radio. You're familiar with those for people who they're not on the electrical grid. And that just having a radio brings great joy to people who otherwise have very little, I think. I think you've learned to benefit from that. And that's a very touching thing. Okay. And then you had another example, but first you mentioned Muslims and Christians in Nigeria. This is so relevant, brought to the attention by President Trump recently. How in the world, I have dabbled with this myself when I was in Lagos, and I found that there was no problem at all between clerics of the two religions. They got along perfectly fine. Is there really conflict to be dealt with, or are we imagining it?
I mean, in Nigeria, I think there are a couple of things. One is that Nigeria is a multicultural, multi-religious society, and the vast majority, 80% or more, of Nigerians think that that's a good thing. Not only do they support religious freedom in their country, they actively consider it a good thing to have a diversity, different religious perspectives. So in that sense, there isn't, and then there's strong cooperation among the religious leadership in different ways. I think there are two dynamics that are at play in Nigeria. One is that there are some states in the north that, in Nigeria is a federal system with respect for local law. In the south, in southern parts, which is a majority Christian, there's a focus on customary law, which is regulated by the custom, which to many who are not from there, including Muslims, seems very foreign. In the north, they say, well, our custom is Sharia law. We have Sharia law in certain states. And so there's ongoing sets of issues around that dynamic, customary law, Sharia law, that plays out across Nigeria, and is an issue that they deal with, particularly not necessarily about religion in the theological sense, but around how the society is governed. So that comes up. And the second issue is around there's been a huge uptake on rural violence, gunmen attacking villages, and reprisal tit for tat killings throughout the center and north of Nigeria. In many cases, particularly where a Christian community is being attacked, whether by Muslims or by others, they're often attacks on churches and religious sites. And we see that around the world. It's quite tragic. It's really tragic, but often if you want to do collective harm to a group of people, destroying their churches, destroying their cemeteries, attacking is one of the targets that plays out. So that is happening. I think it's not to say it's a Christian Muslim thing or theological conflict, but you do have attacks on holy sites, including in Christian areas on churches and in other areas on mosques, that are done not necessarily from a theological perspective, but they're done to inflict harm on everyone to whom that church was a special place. And so there's some yeah, so that's really tragic.
Let me state the obvious. Each case is unique, isn't it? You cannot do in Nigeria what you would do in Mozambique and so
right.
forth. Yeah. Olga from Haiti, but living in New York, turns out that posts that the very sad situation in Haiti, very bad situation in general. She points out that gangs rule the majority of the country, unfortunately, even the capital, I think something like 70%. It's really quite shocking. People have no employment. They are beaten down on social media for not following protocols or falling asleep. And she says, this makes me sad. This is a existential issue. The young people have very few options. If someone offers them something, Olga, I'm kind of extrapolating, permit me. A young person or young man in particular, if he has nothing and if somebody with bad motives approaches him and offers him something, he's likely to go with it. Maybe not because he wants to, but because he has no other options. That's more a statement than a question, Mike, but what are your reflections on that?
Yeah, maybe three. One is that the first reflection is that one of the real tragedies, and I've only started following Haiti more recently and following this exact question. Olga, I'd love to keep in touch on it too, because it's one that's been really front of mind for myself.
Mm-hmm.
One is that in Haiti, like in a lot of places, the negative actors like the gangs or Boko Haram or whoever tend to be much more sophisticated in their use of social media and their authentic connection with young people than those who do want to do good. And so people who are, jobs training centers or the government or others, religious leaders are often really quite bad at connecting with young people in general. And then specifically bad at connecting with young people online. So sometimes one of the problems is the proliferation of negative stuff on and negative content. The other is the real gap that's left by the lack of positive or alternative content. And like I say, the best way to maintain your garden, the best way to control weeds is to tend your garden. And if nothing positive is being planted, then of course the weeds are going to come in. And so I think that's one element. I think the second element on Haiti that really is just, I find absolutely alarming, is a lot of the stuff that I see on Haitian social media or that have shared to me on Haitian social media would never be accepted that are being shared by the gangs would not be accepted if they were being shared by the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico or by Boko Haram in Africa or by the Taliban in Afghanistan. But for some reason, a lot of the things that are clearly violations of the own rules of what's allowed on Instagram or Facebook or whatever are not those aren't being enforced in Haiti. And I think that's something that really advocacy groups and Haitian Americans and Haitian groups could really do a lot to advocate to the tech companies that this stuff shouldn't be allowed, and the Haitian the platforms in Haiti should be as well regulated and policed as those in other parts of the world.
Yes.
Yeah. And maybe the third is just how important it is right now in Haiti. I mean, the degree to which um, you know, the degree to which there's the ability to begin laying the groundwork for alternative lives, alternative ways of living, alternative ways of making your money, of surviving for young people in Haiti is really critical, particularly in advance of the gang suppression force and all of the. So the heavy security stuff is, if that stuff really gets going, it's really important for things
Mhm.
to strengthen society and invest in young people for that to get started now before there's more
Yeah.
serious security evidence.
There's the added element of, in fact, the gangs have produced coalitions. They call it the G8. That's kind of funny, isn't it? Gang, the G for gang. Um, and one of the most notorious ones, his nom de guerre is barbecue, uh, has charisma and has political pretensions. He wants to be, I believe, he wants to be president of Haiti. So the gangs who are doing all this destruction, as you said, they're very good at communicating on social media, and they do have charisma. Um, I would just say that totally personal comment. The situation we see in Haiti, we would love to see solutions. First, we have to recognize that what we have is the consequence of bad policies over many generations. Sometimes, if bad policies are perpetuated, the options become more and more limited. I mean, I would love, as anybody, to see some improvement. First, we have
Well,
to recognize that what we've done has been a failure. Olga, you wanted to unmute?
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. One of the things that I'm working on that I just started and I've spoken to other people, and today I'm going to make a video, is the fact that when we send money to Haiti, we send about $4.1 billion in transfer to Haiti in the diaspora.
Mhm.
And they take out $1.50 with each transfer, which amounts to millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, which started since 2011. So what I've done is I did research to see how that money gets to Haiti. First, it goes to the bank, then from the national bank, from there to the Minister of Finance, then to the Minister of Education, and they're supposed to use that money for schooling, tuition, and feeding the kids. All of that money, there's no accountability for it, and I've made a list of all of the finance ministers and the education and Bartoli from 2011 until now. And I'm going to call them out on social media and have everyone, disperse it throughout and asking where's the money. And we want the money for the kids.
Well, thank you, Olga. And I see very positive things happen. I'm going to put Mike and Olga in touch. Olga might know Linda Cesar in Miami, who's working on this. I would like to put the three of you together, and I think all three of you are very inspired in different ways. Mike, we have just a couple of minutes left. Half of our participants today are in Ukraine. The challenge they face is that of public opinion worldwide and the susceptibility to believe the Kremlin propaganda. This is totally outside of the realm of your mission. But do you have any comments of what is a inspired, very skillful Ukrainian to think and do in trying to correct these incorrect images of being Nazis and agents of the West and these terrible images that seem to be gaining traction in the global South?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think, one of the biggest challenges um, beyond convincing anyone of any particular view, or is the first message is that the people of Ukraine are real people, that they matter, and I think the degree to which ordinary people, there's certain things that the Ukrainian government and the ministries of foreign affairs and so forth can do at their level, but the degree to which there's people to people connections, um, is one of the biggest bedrocks against outside manipulation. We've seen that again and again, that um, the ties between ordinary people are things that can build some of the best resilience to state-sponsored, disinformation. And so
Mm-hmm.
I would encourage anyone involved in Ukraine today to not only rely on government leaders and grand diplomacy to build bridges, but maybe through participating in courses like this one, but more broadly, to connect with people from other societies, for them, help them understand what what's going on in Ukraine, what it's like for a Ukrainian today, what you guys are thinking about in terms of the trajectory of the conflict was meant these past few years. So I guess maybe that would be where I would begin. And if I've learned one thing, is that officials and elites, whether they're good guys or bad guys, are a very small part of the communications pie. And then a focus on ties between people, both from people to people, is one of the most effective ways to
This is
build a bridge.
this shows great wisdom, Mike. And going back to your wonderful quote, if you can't see it, you can't be it. That's a great quote, something to keep in mind, that simply to humanize, I mean, the Kremlin has done everything possible to dehumanize the enemy. That's what happens during conflict. But to humanize, that's the mission of normal people who want, and we have to point out that even in the midst of a war and resource scarcity, the government of Ukraine has had the wisdom to create new embassies in Latin America and in Africa, perhaps also in Asia. I'm not sure, but the Foreign Ministry of Ukraine seems to understand quite well what you've just told us. Well, Mike, we're very grateful. This is a rare opportunity to see someone. You've done this for 17 years. You've had, I think, more success. You've increasing amounts of success. This is really praiseworthy. What are the takeaways that you would want us to think of when we're thinking forward about how to convince bad actors that the people suffering are real people? How do we tell us how you, well, you have told us, but do you have any summarizing or parting thoughts on that?
Maybe what I would maybe end with is that, maybe at a philosophical level, never before has there been such a disconnect between authority and influence. And you have people who are in authority who have no influence. In a place like Haiti, for example, you have people who are influential who have no position, who are in no position of authority. Social media influencers, talk show hosts, the local people who are trusted, who run the markets in South Sudan. And the degree to which you're able to access the people who have influence, who shape how people participate, I think is tremendously it is tremendously valuable. And I think we're in an age, in a lot of ways, every day the front page of the newspaper is about this deal or that deal, and elite bargains. But that's really only half the story. And every single one of us, and not only every one of us here on the call, but also everyone fighting in Sudan for one side or the other, everyone fighting in Congo, or in who decides whether to participate in a gang or not every morning in Haiti. They may have bad choices, they may be coerced, but there still is a choice, as bad as it may be. And the degree to which you're able to connect with people who have influence that are not necessarily the leaders, but the ordinary people, are tremendously effective. And that's how, when it wasn't by going to negotiate with the leadership of Boko Haram, but it was by reaching the ordinary people, that so many left the movement. The same in Sudan, we broadcast directly to the fighters about war crimes, to bypass what their leadership is telling them, and advocate to them to not participate in war crimes. So I wouldn't ignore. I think the power of ordinary people, including the rank and file in armed groups and so forth, is really very underestimated these days, and probably something that's worth all of us spending more time thinking about, investing in.
Yeah, that's great wisdom. We really thank you. And again, Ukraine, which doesn't have the extending influence of being everywhere in the world, um, does have embassies in key countries. And sometimes, if you don't have millions of people available, sometimes the embassy can be the source of people to people. If the officials in the embassy understand the wisdom that you have just shared with us. So,
And
thank you, Mike.
maybe, yeah, maybe one last thought on that question as I ponder it a little bit more. If I was in a leadership position in Ukraine, I guess there's a tendency to look. I don't want to speak from the Ukraine position, from the American position, the U.S. Well, why does this country not that country mistrustful of America and not sympathetic? There may be the same. And why is this country not sympathetic to Ukraine politically? I would flip it the opposite. I'd flip it the opposite way, and rather than going to sort of where are their problems, where are their assets? Where are countries that have stepped up? What are segments of the population that seem really sympathetic? Where's the message really come across? And I'd probably begin from what you have, and then use what you have to build what you don't have. In the same way, if you have one broken leg, focus first on the leg that works, and to get yourself around while the other one heals. And so I'd look to sort of see where in Latin America or Africa is there good traction. Are people sort of resistant to some of the negative things coming out? Understand why they, if there's negative things happening in 20, if there's bad stuff thrown out to 20 countries, 10 of them are receptive. Focus on the other 10 first. Understand why people were resistant there, and then use that insight to build back in the others.
Again, that's tremendous wisdom. There was a young social entrepreneur from Colorado who went to Lagos, and I was there when he met 200 or 300 young Nigerians. They came with their white shirts and their ties, and expecting to find solutions. And he shocked them all. He said, "I'm pretty sure I can guess what your problems are. You don't have jobs, the educational system. Now, please forget all of that and think, what is it that you do have?" This is exactly what Mike is saying here. And of course, I don't know the final outcome of what came of that, but I remember the audience being very shocked because they all came able to articulate what the problems were. And of course, you need to be able to do that. But the challenge was, what are your resources? What are your equities? I'm trying not to make this sound like a sermon. I'm just echoing what Mike has said with his 17 years of experience. Mike Jobbins, thank you so much for today. I invite you and everyone else on the call. This Thursday, we have Erin McKee, who was, before the Trump administration dismantled the U.S. Agency for International Development, she was the head of the entire Europe aspect of USAID. When AID was dismantled, she became the CEO of something called Nova Ukraine and works in Chicago to do whatever possible to enhance Ukraine's equities, to make its message more clear to the world. So we'll listen to Erin on Thursday. Mike and everybody, thank you so much. Thank you, and
take care, everyone.
Keep doing wonderful things.
Thanks, and happy
not
to keep in
everybody
touch.
will thank you, but I will. Okay.
Thanks a lot. We'll keep in touch, and
Very
good luck
good
to everyone wherever you are.
Okay, excellent. Thanks,
Don't,
Mike.
don't forget to do the connection.
I
Thank
will.
you.
Please.
I
Okay.
promise.
All righty.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.